My name is Kaelin. I was once a thief, a whisper in the shadows of Riften. My trade was silence. A loose floorboard was a mortal enemy, a guard's cough, a symphony of information. I could move across a gravel path without displacing a single stone. I lived and breathed in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Now my trade was managing the apocalypse that followed in his wake. He shifted his weight and the sound rolled down the mountainside. It was not a simple clank of metal on metal. It was a chord of dissonant bells, a grinding of tectonic plates, the shriek of a soul being rent from its moorings. A flock of crows burst from a dead tree 100 yards away, their frantic calls swallowed by the lingering echo. Down in the valley I saw a shape detach from the crumbling wall of the ruin, a bandit likely drawn by the sound. He stood for a moment, peering up the slope, then scrambled back inside. The trap was sprung before we had even begun. This was my life now. I was the scout, the pathfinder, the one who read the signs and prepared the way. But my companion was a walking earthquake, a mobile siege engine powered by something dark and hungry. My skills were not obsolete, but they had been repurposed. I was no longer the agent of silence. I was the herald of the storm, the one who slips through the keyhole to unbar the door for the battering ram. He turned his head, the horned helmet moving with a groan of protesting steel. I could not see his face, only the two burning embers of his eyes within the oppressive dark of the visor. He never spoke much. The armor did the talking for him. It whispered in the quiet moments, a sibilant chorus of promises and threats that slid into the edges of my hearing. The smith who forged this nightmare had not used hammers and tongs. He had used torment and damnation. Each plate was a bound agony. "They know we are here," I said, my voice feeling thin and useless in the vast, cold air. The helmet dipped in a slow nod. Of course they knew. A dragon could have landed on their crumbling watchtower with more subtlety. He took a step, then another, his armored boots crushing loose rock into powder. Each footfall was a drumbeat announcing a doom. I sighed, the breath turning to smoke in the chill, and drew my own blades. They were simple steel, well-honed and balanced, tools of quiet work. They felt like toys. We began the descent. I moved ahead, as was our way. I was still light on my feet, my leather armor making only the faintest whisper against the dry scrub. I scanned the rocks for hidden sentries, my eyes tracing the most shadowed paths. It was instinct, the ingrained habit of a lifetime. But it was also a fool's errand. The thunder of his advance rendered all my caution theatrical. It was like trying to set a snare in the path of an avalanche. The ruin was old, some forgotten imperial fort from the days when the border was a raw, contested thing. The bandits who had claimed it had likely desperate men, pushed to the fringes by war and poverty. They would be hungry, paranoid, and now, thanks to my companion, terrified. Terror made men unpredictable. I reached the broken gate first, slipping through a gap where the ancient wood had rotted away. The courtyard was a mess of debris and makeshift barricades. A fire pit smoldered in the center, sending a greasy plume of smoke into the sky. 2 men were there, armed with notched axes and wearing mismatched pieces of leather and iron. They were not looking at the gate. They were staring, wide-eyed, at the path leading up to it, their knuckles white on the hafts of their weapons. They were listening to the approaching symphony of destruction. I could have taken them. 2 quick thrusts from the shadows, 2 bodies slumping to the ground before they could even process the surprise. That was the old way. That was the art of it. But there was no art here. There was only overwhelming force. He arrived. He did not use the gap in the gate. He walked through the gate. The old wood exploded into splinters and dust, the iron hinges screaming as they were torn from the stone. The two bandits stumbled back, their faces masks of pure primal fear. One of them let out a choked cry. The other simply stared, paralyzed. The Thane of Whiterun, the harbinger of the companions, the Dragonborn, he had many titles, but in that moment he was just a monster. He did not draw his weapon. He simply raised a gauntleted hand. The air grew thick, heavy with a pressure that made my teeth ache. A crackling purple light gathered around his fist, the smell of ozone and burnt sugar filling the courtyard. The bandit who had cried out turned to run. He did not make it 2 steps. A bolt of soul-trapping energy lashed out, and the man dissolved into a cloud of shimmering ash and a final keening wail. The second bandit dropped his axe and fell to his knees, babbling pleas to gods who had long since abandoned this place. The armored figure walked past him without a glance and kicked in the door to the main keep. The sound of the kick was like the crack of doom. The babbling man was left to my care. I approached him, my daggers feeling heavy in my hands. He looked up at me, his eyes streaming with tears, his face smeared with dirt and terror. He saw me not as a threat, but as a potential savior, a normal man in the face of an impossible horror. "Please," he whispered, "what is that thing?" I had no answer for him. I did not know anymore. I knew the man inside the armor, or I thought I did. I had shared mead with him, stood back to back with him against a tide of draugr. But the armor was changing him, or perhaps it was merely revealing what was already there. "It is his will," I said, the words feeling hollow. I ended the man's terror with a quick, clean cut. It was the only mercy I had left to give. I did not feel pity. I did not feel remorse. I felt a profound weariness, a sense of being an accomplice to a natural disaster. Inside the keep, the sounds of slaughter had already begun. There were screams, the sharp ring of steel against the Daedric plate, followed by the wet, final sounds of lives ending. I followed him in, my senses on high alert not for the enemy but for the ricochet of a misplaced spell or the backswing of a great sword that took no notice of friend or foe. The main hall was a charnel house. Bodies were strewn across the floor, some burned to a crisp, others shattered by brute force. The bandit chief, a large orc in heavy armor, was the last one standing. He was roaring, swinging a massive warhammer in a desperate arc. The hammer struck the Dragonborn's chest with a sound like a cathedral bell being struck by lightning. The orc's arms buckled from the impact. The Daedric plate was not even scratched. The armored figure did not even seem to notice the blow. He slowly raised his own weapon, a great sword that was as much a part of the set as the rest of the armor. It was a jagged length of obsidian that seemed to drink the torchlight. The orc's roar died in his throat, replaced by a gurgle of fear. The black blade swung and the fight was over. I moved through the room, my job now to search the bodies, to look for maps, keys, or anything of value. It was grim work, but necessary. As I knelt beside one of the bandits, I could hear the whispers from the armor, clearer now in the echoing silence of the hall. They were not words, not in any language I knew, but I felt their meaning. They spoke of hunger, of power, of dominion. They were the thoughts of the metal itself, or of the entity bound within it. I felt a cold dread, but also a strange, perverse fascination. The power was seductive. It was absolute. He stood over the orc's body, motionless. The red light from his armor pulsed, casting a hellish glow over the carnage. I found a note on the chief's body, a hastily scrawled message about a delivery of skooma from the south. I stood and presented it to him. He took the parchment in a gauntlet that could have crushed my skull without effort. He held it for a moment, then it simply burst into purple flame, consumed by the magic that clung to him like a shroud. "No distractions," the voice from the helmet rumbled. It was deeper than I remembered, layered with a metallic resonance that was not human. We were not here for bandits or skooma. We were here because a Jarl had heard rumors of a word wall deep within the foundations of this old fort. That was all that mattered. The pursuit of power. The feeding of a hunger that had no end. I found the hidden door behind a tapestry depicting the victory at Red Mountain. It was, of course, locked. The mechanism was old and rusted, the tumblers stiff. In my previous life, this would have been a moment of quiet tension, a delicate dance of pick and torsion wrench, my ear pressed against the wood, listening for the faintest click. Now I simply stepped aside. He placed a hand on the door. There was no magic, no shouting, just pressure. The stone around the doorframe cracked. The iron lock groaned, bent, and then snapped with a percussive bang that echoed like a gunshot. The door swung inward into darkness. The air that billowed out was ancient, cold, and dry. It smelled of dust and forgotten things. This was my domain. The darkness, the traps, the secrets. I took a breath, trying to center myself, to recall the thief I used to be. I lit a torch, the flame seeming small and fragile. "I will go first," I said. "There will be traps." He did not object. He simply waited, a looming shadow in the doorway, the pulsing of his armor the only light behind me. I stepped into the dark, my senses straining. The torchlight flickered over stone walls slick with dampness and corridors that twisted into nothingness. The silence was absolute. It was a perfect, beautiful, terrifying silence. I felt a pang of something like homesickness. Then he stepped across the threshold. The silence shattered. The grinding of his boots on the stone floor was an obscenity. The low hum of his enchantments filled the air, a constant, oppressive drone that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Every shift of his weight sent a cascade of echoes down the corridor, announcing our presence to anything that might be lurking in the depths. I saw the pressure plate on the floor just in time. A simple thing, a stone slab slightly raised from its neighbors. It would likely trigger a dart trap or a swinging blade. I held up a hand, motioning for him to stop. I carefully stepped over it, my body a study in controlled movement. I turned to guide him around it. He simply walked over it. There was a loud click and a volley of poisoned darts shot out from murder holes in the wall. They struck his armor with a series of sharp pings and fell harmlessly to the floor. He did not even break stride. He just kept walking, the relentless grinding advance of a glacier. I closed my eyes for a moment. It was not malice. It was not even carelessness. It was a fundamental disconnect from the world I understood. To him, the world was not a thing of intricate, delicate dangers. It was an obstacle to be shattered. A door was not to be unlocked but broken. A trap was not to be disarmed but endured. A creature was not to be outmaneuvered but obliterated. We continued deeper. The architecture shifted from old imperial stone to something far older. The distinctive cyclopean masonry of the Nords. We were in a tomb. The air grew colder, heavier. The walls were lined with burial niches and the silence was thick with the weight of sleeping dead. This was the true test. Draugr were light sleepers. A careless footstep, a dislodged stone could awaken a whole host of them. I moved with the exaggerated care of a cat stalking a bird, my feet barely touching the ground. I held my breath, listening. The only sound was the infernal symphony behind me. The gray aunch of a pauldron rubbing against a chest plate. The deep, resonant thump of a boot, the constant maddening hum of captive souls. A draugr sat on a throne at the end of the hall, a withered husk in ancient armor, a great axe resting across its lap. It was dormant, its head slumped forward. A high-level one, a white lord at least. With care, I could have slipped past it or perhaps put a dagger in the gap between its helmet and cuirass, ending it before it could rise. But there was no care. There was only him. The White Lord's head snapped up. Its eyes, 2 points of cold blue light, flared to life. It had not seen us. It had heard us from 100 feet away. It rose from its throne, a dry, rattling sound coming from its chest, and let out a desiccated roar. The roar was a command. All around us in the shadowed niches, other blue lights began to glow. The stone lids of sarcophagi began to grind open. He seemed pleased. He drew his black sword, and the runes on its surface flared with a hungry crimson light. "Good," his voice rumbled. "A proper welcome." The fight was a whirlwind of violence and noise. The draugr swarmed him, their ancient iron weapons scraping uselessly against his Daedric plate. He moved among them like a reaper through wheat, his greatsword cleaving through bone and armor with sickening ease. Shouts of power echoed in the confined space, shaking dust from the ceiling. A wave of pure force sent a half-dozen of the creatures flying, shattering them against the far wall. My role, as always, was peripheral. I danced around the edges of the melee, my daggers finding purchase in the exposed backs and joints of draugr that were focused on the greater threat. I was a jackal, darting in to steal a kill from the lion's feast. It was efficient, it was effective, and it was utterly without honor. After the last draugr had been reduced to a pile of dust and bone, a profound silence fell. It was a wounded. It was silence, still ringing with the echoes of the battle. He stood in the center of the room, the souls of the slain draugr swirling around him like a faint mist before being absorbed by his enchantments. The glow of his armor seemed brighter now, more vibrant. It had fed. We pressed on through chambers filled with swinging axe pendulums that he simply walked through, their blades shattering against his armor. Through rooms filled with intricate puzzles that he solved by smashing the mechanisms. I stopped trying to sneak. I stopped trying to be careful. I simply followed in his wake of devastation, my torch held high, my daggers ready. I had become the attendant to a god of destruction. Finally, we entered a vast cavern. A waterfall cascaded down one side, the air thick with mist. And there, on the far wall, was what we had come for. A word wall, its surface covered in the claw-scratch script of the dragons. As he approached it, the word began to glow, a brilliant blue light that pulsed with power. The air filled with a low chanting chorus, the ghosts of ancient Nords whispering a forgotten word of power. He stood before it, drinking it in. I watched as a stream of ethereal energy flowed from the wall and into him, a surge of knowledge and power that was ancient beyond human comprehension. He staggered back, his body shuddering. And then, from the massive sarcophagus at the base of the wall, it emerged. A dragon priest. It rose into the air, its masked face a vision of ancient malice. Its robes were tattered, but its hands crackled with destructive magic. It spoke, its voice a dry hiss that scraped at the inside of my skull. "You are not worthy." The battle that followed was on another scale entirely. The priest summoned Atranax of frost and flame, carpeting the cavern in ice and fire. Bolts of lightning, thick as a man's arm, slammed into the Dragonborn, creating thunderous explosions. He weathered it all, his enchanted armor drinking the magic, like a sponge. He responded with his own shouts, blasts of force that shook the very foundations of the mountain. I was useless. I hid behind a pillar, my daggers feeling like toothpicks. This was a battle of titans, of forces that could unmake the world. I was an insect, caught between the footsteps of giants. The noise was deafening, the light blinding. But then I saw it. The priest was drawing power from 3 glowing stones set high up on the cavern walls. They were conduits, feeding him, making him all but invincible. He was too powerful to be fought head-on. He had to be weakened. This was a job for me. The Dragonborn could not be distracted. He was locked in a brutal contest of will and power with the priest. He was the anchor, the focus of all its rage, and that gave me my opening. The chaos was my cover, the roaring of spells, the crash of summoned creatures, the thunder of the Thuum. It was the perfect distraction. The very thing I had cursed for so long was now my greatest asset. I moved. I scrambled up the rock face, my fingers and toes finding purchase in the small cracks. I was a shadow again, but a different kind of shadow. I was not hiding from the noise. I was using it. The explosion of a fire atronach covered the sound of my ascent. A blast of unrelenting force from the Dragonborn rattled the walls, making my hand slip. But the priest was too busy countering it to notice the small figure climbing towards its power source. I reached the first stone. It was a pulsing, malevolent crystal, warm to the touch. I did not know how to disable it. I had no magic, no special tools. I only had my daggers and my desperation. I drove my blade into the fissure where the crystal met the rock and pried. The stone resisted, then with a loud crack it broke free and tumbled into the darkness below, its light extinguishing. The priest let out a shriek of rage. Its power faltered for a moment. The Dragonborn pressed his advantage, unleashing a torrent of fire from his mouth. I did not wait to watch. I was already moving towards the second stone. The priest saw me then. It turned its masked face towards me, its eyes glowing with fury. It raised a hand, and a shard of ice the size of a spear formed in the air. I flattened myself against the rock as it flew past, shattering against the stone with a deafening crash. Shards of ice rained down, one of them slicing my arm. I ignored the pain. I reached the second stone and repeated the process, breaking it from its setting. Another shriek from the priest. Its power was visibly waning now. The spectral armor that surrounded it flickered. Only one left. It was on the far side of the cavern, across a wide chasm. There was no way to climb to it. But there was a narrow, crumbling ledge that ran beneath it. It was a fool's path, a spider's thread over a fatal drop. The Dragonborn saw my predicament. He was still engaged with the priest, but he turned his helmet towards me for a fraction of a second. Then he unleashed a new shout, one I had never heard before. The world seemed to slow down, the air turning thick and syrupy. The priest's movements became sluggish, its spells forming with agonizing slowness. He had bought me time. I ran. My feet flew across the narrow ledge, loose stones skittering into the abyss. The world was a strange, silent movie. I could see the priest turning, its spell crawling through the air towards me. I could see the Dragonborn preparing another assault. It was all happening in slow motion, but my own body was a blur of speed. I reached the final stone. I did not have time to pry it loose. I drew back my arm and threw my dagger, a desperate, hopeful throw. The blade spun end over end, a glint of steel in the magical twilight, and struck the crystal dead center. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Time snapped back to its normal pace with a dizzying lurch. The priest's power broke completely, its spectral armor dissolved, and it slumped in the air, vulnerable. The Dragonborn did not waste the opportunity. His black greatsword flashed, and the dragon priest's head flew from its shoulders. The body hung in the air for a moment, then disintegrated into ancient dust. Silence. A true and total silence, broken only by the gentle sound of the waterfall and the dripping of water from the ceiling. The red glow of the Daedric armor seemed to burn twice as bright in the gloom. He stood over the pile of dust, his sword point resting on the floor. He did not look at me. He did not offer thanks. He simply walked to the priest's sarcophagus and looted it, taking the mask and the staff within. More power. Always more power. I made my way back down, my body aching, my arm bleeding freely. I wrapped it with a strip of cloth from my pack. As I approached him, the whispers from the armor started again. But this time they sounded different. They were not just threats and promises of power. There was something else in them, something that sounded almost like approval. He turned to me, the burning eyes in his helmet seeming to pierce right through me. "You are useful," he rumbled, and then he turned and began the long walk out of the tomb. Useful. That was what I was. I was a tool, like his sword, like his armor, a specialized tool for a specific purpose. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of a battle between gods and monsters, I realized I did not mind. My old life was a distant memory, a ghost of a man who valued silence and subtlety. That man would not have survived a day with the Dragonborn. That man was weak. I followed him out, my footsteps lighter than his, but heavier than they had ever been before. The noise of his armor no longer grated on my nerves. It was a comfort. It was the sound of safety, of proximity to ultimate power. It was the sound of survival. We emerged from the ruin into the fading light of dusk. The sky was a tapestry of orange and purple. The world seemed fragile, temporary. We had delved into the bones of the earth, fought creatures of myth, and emerged victorious. We were more than men, or at least he was, and I was his shadow. We made camp a few miles from the ruin in a small, sheltered copse of trees. He did not remove the armor. I do not think he could anymore. He simply sat by the fire I built, a silent, brooding mountain of black iron. The flames danced and reflected off the jagged plates, making it look as though he were wreathed in fire. I tended to my wounds, stitched the cut on my arm, and cooked what little food we had. I offered him some, but he waved it away. I do not know if he still needed to eat. The armor seemed to sustain him, feeding on the souls he harvested. As I sat there watching him, I thought about my transformation. I had started this journey as a paid guide, a hired hand. I had resented his noise, his carelessness, his brute force. It was an affront to my craft. But I had been wrong. My craft was not silence. It was survival, and I had adapted. The world was not a quiet place. It was a place of war, of dragons, of ancient evils stirring in their tombs. Silence was a luxury, an illusion. The true currency was power, the power to smash, to destroy, to endure. He understood that. The armor understood that. And now so did I. I no longer flinched when he moved. I no longer plotted ways to muffle the sound. I had learned to read the sounds, to use them. The particular groan of a knee joint told me he was about to charge. The high-pitched whine from the pauldrons meant he was gathering magical energy. The symphony of destruction had become my sheet music. I knew my part. Later that night, as he kept his silent vigil, I slept, but my dreams were filled with noise. The grinding of metal, the roar of the Thuum, the screams of the dying, and through it all, the whispers of the armor promising me a place at the right hand of a god, promising me that I too could be more than just a man. I too could be a useful tool. I woke up just before dawn. The fire had died to embers. He was gone. For a heart-stopping moment, I felt a surge of panic, of abandonment. The silence was terrifying. It felt empty, exposed. I felt naked without the protective shell of his noise. Then I heard it in the distance, the unmistakable earth-shaking clang of Daedric plate on stone. He was hunting. I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. I quickly gathered our things and set off in the direction of the sound, my new compass, my new North Star. I found him at the bottom of a ravine, standing over the corpse of a saber cat. The creature was nearly torn in two. He had not used a weapon. He did not need to. He turned as I approached, the ember eyes in his helmet fixed on me. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply stood and waited for my orders. We traveled for many more months. We delved into the darkest corners of Skyrim, from the bottom of forgotten lakes to the highest wind-scoured peaks. We fought Falmer in their subterranean cities, their blindness making them exquisitely sensitive to sound. My initial forays into their territory were a nightmare of stress, my every nerve screaming as the cacophony behind me threatened to bring the whole hive down upon us. But I learned to create diversions, to throw rocks to pull their patrols into his path. I turned his weakness into my weapon. I became a master of choreographing slaughter. We entered the ghostly halls of Labyrinthian, where the spectral voices of long-dead mages whispered madness into our ears. The whispers of his armor answered them, a dialogue of the damned that shielded my mind from their assault. The armor's malevolence was a bulwark against other lesser evils. We even journeyed into the soul cairn, a dimension of swirling gray mist and trapped spirits. The very air was made of despair. But his armor was forged from such things. He strode through that haunted realm like a king returning to his ancestral lands. The lesser spirits fled before him. The keepers of that place treated him with a wary respect. He was one of them, and I, walking in his shadow, was granted safe passage. Through it all, the man I knew continued to fade. His name was Vorlag. I remembered it sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. A Nord, from Rorikstead. He had a laugh once, a booming, infectious thing. He liked Honningbrew mead. He had wanted to be a hero. I do not know if he still wanted that. I do not know if he wanted anything at all, beyond the next word wall, the next powerful artifact, the next soul to feed the ever-hungry metal that was now his skin and his skeleton. Sometimes, when he was still, I would see a small tremor in his gauntlet, a slight tick of a muscle beneath the plate, a flicker of the prisoner inside the cage. But it never lasted long. The armor would hum, a low, soothing thrum, and the tremor would cease. And I, Kaelin, the thief from Riften, changed as well. I grew harder, more callous. The world of men, of cities and laws and commerce seemed like a child's dream. It was fragile and pointless. The real world was the one of ancient power, of life and death in the dark places of the earth. My daggers were no longer simple steel. One was now a blade of ebony gifted to me by a Dunmer smith in Windhelm who owed the Dragonborn his life. The other was different. It was the dagger I had taken from a vampire lord's coffin. It was cold to the touch, even in the heat of a forge, and it drank the life from those it cut. Using it felt good. It whispered to me, much like his armor whispered to him. A quieter whisper, a more personal one. We stood on the precipice of our final journey at a secret temple high in the mountains. We were to go to Sovngarde itself, to face Alduin, the World Eater. A fitting end. A battle for the soul of the world. As he prepared to enter the portal, he paused. He turned to me. For the first time in what felt like years, he seemed to be truly looking at me, not through me. "This is my road to walk," the voice from the helmet said. It was still resonant, still metallic, but there was a sliver of something else beneath it. A sliver of Vorlag. "You are free of your oath." I looked at him, this walking god of death. I looked at the jagged black armor, the pulsing red light, the helmet that was both a face and a cage. And I thought of the silence that would follow his departure, the empty, unprotected silence of a world without him. I thought of the quiet alleys of Riften, the thrill of a silent heist, the life I had left behind. It felt like a story someone else had told me. It had no reality, no weight. "No," I said, and my voice was steady. I rested a hand on the pommel of my vampiric dagger. "My place is with you." A long moment passed. The wind howled around us, whipping snow from the peaks. The portal to Sovngarde shimmered, a liquid, shimmering aurora. The helmet dipped in a slow, final nod. Then he turned and strode into the light, and I followed him, as I always did. I followed the sound of his armor, the grinding, clanging, soul-shrieking music of my new life, into the realm of the gods and the end of the world. I was no longer a thief who valued silence. I was a creature of the storm, and the thunder was my home.